In this video, I want to talk about false awakenings. It's not a new subject. It's something you should be familiar with if you've been following this channel for more than a year. But it comes down to the following. Anytime the population is in distress because the population is tired of a situation or of the economic circumstances, the enemy, that Satan, comes with an awakening. He, with his demons, will use agents to wake people up. Yes, he will. For example, it can be that, okay, let me just take an example right now. You have Denmark near the end of the Napoleon era, and it can be that in Denmark the Danish population lives in an impoverished state because the Danish government is more interested in investing in Norway and the overseas territories of Norway. Why? Because Norway and Denmark had the same king. Even though the Danish government ran both Norway and Denmark, Norway was officially still a separate country. But Norway had more farmland, more natural resources, and more industrial potential back then, so the Danish government invests a lot in Norway instead of investing in Denmark. Now, let's say this is going on. The people are not aware of it. They live in Denmark. They speak Danish, and secondly German. German is also an important language over there. Norway is Norway. It's across the sea. They speak the same language, Danish, over there. That was also official language of Norway, but the people live in Denmark. But let's say now that one day there is this group of activists that spreads pamphlets around. In Copenhagen, in Aarhus, I'm not Danish, so forgive me if I pronounce the names in an incorrect manner. You have this small activist group began to spread pamphlets to the people, inform the people of the facts that Norway's export was 4 times more than Denmark's export. And it was Danish tax money that the people paid that made Norway so prosperous. Now, what would happen now is that some people will just dismiss it. They think, I have enough issues on my head, I don't want to take Norway's issues either. Others would look at it and realize, don't a minute, this doesn't add up, that the Danish king invests so much in Norway at the expense of the Danish people. So then people began to act out against the policy. And when they began to act out against the policy, they want relief of their own frustration. And then people will begin to riot, because after all they realize that nothing is changing. So now they get more frustrated, and now the frustration escalates. Now, what happened here? It was a false awakening. It was an awakening that only increased violence. Now, anytime there's an awakening, there will be resistance, because people tend to hold on to the status quo. So I'm not talking about that. But in this case, an example I just gave onto you, there was no long-term solution offered. People were frustrated, they couldn't understand why, and now the situation was exposed onto them. But the people were in denial. The people didn't look at the bigger picture. Because if they would have looked at the bigger picture, they would have realized, hold on a minute, if the king of Denmark is also king of Norway, and in Norway they all speak Danish, and Norway is far bigger than Denmark, why are all our politicians going to Norway all the time? If they would have looked at the bigger picture, they would have realized something doesn't add up. But they had no intention of looking at the bigger picture. They just wanted relief. They were relief seeking. So when the situation was posed onto them, they now wanted relief from the situation. So they were not into a solution at all. So it was a false awakening. And false awakenings are meant to distract the people further from what's going on. Now, why did I use the example of Denmark at the end of the Napoleon era? It is because it was near the end of the Napoleon era that a shift took place. Norway was ceded to the King of Sweden. It was not ceded onto Sweden. Norway did not become Swedish. The Kingdom of Norway was handed over to the King of Sweden. Now, for those at the time who would have thought, you know what, maybe this is better, now more attention will go to Denmark. Well, it didn't work that way. Denmark depended much on the economy of Norway for its stability. Because Denmark had colonies like in the Caribbean, in India, but those did not bring forth much. They didn't profit Denmark that much. And the population also, Denmark also had a low population. So their economic security was Norway. When Denmark lost Norway, a recession took place. So the situation became far worse. And now, instead of Denmark, Sweden became the dominant regional power in Scandinavia. For long it was Denmark. Now it became Sweden. So now the Swedish influence became more important. So there was a shift that was about to happen. So, in this case, the powers that be, or the big rulers of the world, they used an activist movement before the shift took place to alert the people that the situation, the Danish politics was not fair for the Danish people, because the Norwegians were favored, which was factual. So the people stood up, they wanted relief from that situation. Then the shift took place in which Denmark's influence in Scandinavia decreased so that Sweden could increase. So now economically, Denmark's potential kind of disappeared. So the people that were inspired or provoked by the activist movement against the Danish favoritism towards Norway, they actually helped and contributed to the shift that would be in their disadvantage. While they thought they are protesting and resisting an unfair policy. No, it wasn't an unfair policy. Okay, it was. But by then, seeing relief from that policy, instead of looking at the bigger picture, looking at the long-term impact, they now, in ignorance, contributed to a far worse situation that they really didn't want to be in. Look, I used the example of Denmark at the end of the Napoleon era and the shift that took place, that Norway became an economic extension of the Swedish economy. I used that to illustrate to you that false awakenings are a tool of Satan to divert attention from people so that people wouldn't notice the worst is about to come. Because sit it like this: if there is a shift that would upset the people, you're not going to announce a shift to the people. You're not going to do that, because then it would backfire. No, you will distract the people with something that's going on, that's not right, and then people's energies will be directed at that other thing that doesn't add up. But you triggered them in focusing, or in placing their attention on that other thing that doesn't add up, so that they wouldn't see the shift that you're about to introduce. So when folks are fighting and they're divided about that issue that doesn't add up, you enforce a shift. So that when the shift has happened, it's too late for the people to resist it, because it is too late now. So if people become aware of it then, they may only riot, but even that would be useless because the shift already happened. Now, on the background of this video, you see a shot taken during the Yellow Vest protests. I'm not sure whether this photo was taken in Belgium or France. It doesn't matter. The Yellow Vest movement is a false awakening. Just think about it. Why are people really rioting? It is because they want relief. But do they even consider what the long-term alternatives are? No, they're not. They just want to riot or act out their rage. But they don't see the bigger context. France, let's say this protest was in France. There are more places where the Yellow Vest movement is active, but France faces many challenges. And you have, besides the native white population, you have many other ethnicities that live there. Some of them have been there for generations. Okay? So they all live within a territory. They all depend on the economy, on the national economy over there, which is integrated in the European economy. So they all need to find a way to get along and make it work. But here's the thing, there are folks in France that just don't want to comply. They're only into their own relief. They're really into their own narcissistic expectations. And such folks will always blame another group in the community for what's going on. So what you have now is a country that's dysfunctional, and a big portion of the people realize it's dysfunctional, but they don't really want to openly admit it, because then they also need to admit their own contribution to the dysfunction. And there are folks who will take advantage of it and people admit their contribution to the dysfunction. Nevertheless, folks need to admit their contribution to the dysfunction. Because only then will people really realize that something needs to be done, and that all of them has their natural obligations to cooperate with the well-functioning of the French community. But what's happening now is that you have a movement in which people can act out their rage, and they direct it at the French president, but nothing is really done to make the community better. Nothing is done to contribute to the well-functioning of the French community. At least the French community in France. Okay? So this Yellow Vest movement is really a false awakening to distract people from other things that are going on. Okay? Now the movement is there. And the movement is relevant because it's not something that's going to disappear quickly, because the frustrations that have escalated within France are real. So this movement is an outlet that's been offered onto people to leak out their rage. So the frustrations are there. So this movement is actually reveals the tip of the iceberg. But you shouldn't be distracted by this movement. Okay? What should get people's attention is that the native white French population is in decline. In general, what they call white people are in decline worldwide. They don't have enough babies. The amount of children born is below the replacement rate. Every ethnicity needs to have sufficient children to replace the older generation. That's how ethnicity remains alive. That's how ethnicity remains in existence. The moment an ethnicity doesn't bring forth enough children to match the replacement rate, that ethnicity fades away, often within 3 generations. Because in the 3rd generation, the instability is so huge that any other ethnicity will take over, and that will be the end of that ethnicity. That's how it went with the empires in history. Okay? Now look, it didn't happen all the time that when a regional or world power fell apart, that ethnicity of world power ceased to exist. That didn't always happen, okay? For example, the Egyptians were the world power until the exodus of the Israelites. They didn't fade away, but they still had the replacement rate that was they still matched the replacement rate, okay? So let me go to another example, the ancient Romans. The ancient Romans were a Greek ethnicity. So they were Greek, but were a Greek ethnicity, mixed with refugees from many other towns. The Romans, the real ancient Romans, they died out. Why? They didn't have enough children. They were so into their luxurious lifestyles that they did not think of their posterity. They had kids, but not enough kids, and many of the kids they had, well, they weren't prepared really to operate in a healthy human community. Because ancient Rome was filled with abominations. Okay? So the Roman Empire, I'm just giving you a history lesson here just to inform you, in the beginning it was Roman. It was Greek. Let me just make it plain. Greek was a spoken language, it was Greek. But the Romans were a Greek ethnicity. So the rulers of ancient Rome in the beginning were all Roman. But after a while, the majority of administrators throughout the empire were not Roman. They were either Greek people from the east, or they were Germanic peoples that came from Central Europe. So the Roman Empire was not Roman after a while, and that led to many dysfunction. You know why? Because you can't have the Roman Empire and there are almost no real Romans there to govern that empire. The same way, you can't have Denmark without the Danish people. There needs to be a Danish people to have a Denmark. You know what I'm saying here? If you have Denmark, let's say that, okay, Denmark today has around 5 million, something more than 5 million inhabitants. Let's go back in history. Let's go towards the 18th century when there were around 700,000 Danish people. That's excluded the Schleswig-Holstein duchy, which was German speaking. And let's say now that you had an influx of 200,000 French migrants into Denmark back then. You have 700,000 Danish folks, and now you have 300,000 French that arrive. So now there's a population boost. Now the population in the Kingdom of Denmark is 1 million. But 30% of the population is French. So what's going to happen? That 30% will speak French. And let's say that the French now have many kids, while the Danish don't have many kids. Within 2 generations, the French will be around 60% of the population, and the Danish only 40%. Go to a 3rd generation, probably you will have only 20% of Danish people. And that's how the Danish people would go extinct. And when they've become a minority in their own country, it's not Denmark anymore. It's Denmark in name, was really a second France. Now, why am I speaking about all of this? To point out to you that the real concern that should concern the French people is how they relate to each other as a community. The replacement rate is what should concern them. They should concern with having a stable economy for their children. They should concern with the well-being of their ethnicity, of their group. That's what they should be concerned about. Not about some tax that the French government wanted to enforce. Now look, I didn't intend to make this video this long, but I've given you examples so you can get the context of what I'm saying here. France faces a democratic challenge for the native French. That's what they should be concerned with. And they have now a culture over there, or let me say they have France experienced a cultural decline in which the family values have kind of been thrown out of the window. Now there are still French families that have strong ties, that are pro-family and all that. It still exists, don't get me wrong, but in general they've thrown out the family values that would sustain the demographics of France, if you understand what I'm saying here. So they need to face the debasement of French culture. That should be their main concern, but that is not being addressed here, because you have to address that in order to do something about the demographic challenge. But now nothing is done against the demographic challenge. People only are leaking out their rage, and that will lead to more distraction and more violence. So actually the Yellow Vest movement is really contributing to the self-destruction of France. But many don't see it like that. Many see it as a revival against Europe, as a revival against Brussels. They see it as something good. That is because they don't look at the bigger picture. Well, I'm going to close this video now. I've spoken for over 20 minutes. I also gave you some history lessons in here. I've used history as a parable. I mean, now look, whatever happens around you, acknowledge it, but look at the bigger picture, and beware that you're not taken away or swayed away by false awakenings. That being said, agree with Christ and be at peace.